All right. So, hello, everyone. I'm a bit more nervous than I probably should be, and I'm going to speak too quickly. Um, uh, oh, God. Eric, just make a tweet about it or something. Um, Without spoiling my conclusion, I don't believe that photography killed punch cutting. It was just one of many factors that caused it to change in the 20th century. I'm writing a doctoral dissertation in Braunschweig on German type founding at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. Some of you can see the looming problem at the end of the slide. This presentation is about punch cutting and not so much about typefaces themselves. And no punch cutter, at least since Bedoni, has had more that was written about him than Paul Helmut Radisch, who's sitting in this picture on your right. And he has been written about so much because he cut the punches for Johann van Cribben's typefaces. He was born in 1891, and in 1905 he began a 5-year punch-cutting apprenticeship in Leipzig. However, as most of you probably know, he spent his career at the firm of Enschede in Haarlem in the Netherlands. By the time of Radisch's career, punch cutters weren't responsible anymore for designing the typefaces they cut, at least not usually. This makes Radisch and his contemporaries different from earlier German punch cutters, like Walbaum, for example. Many early typographic punches were cut by goldsmiths, and there are numerous examples of individuals who came to punch cutting from other fields. Walbaum first engraved baking forms out of wood and then musical notation into steel plates before he started cutting typographic punches. Unlike Radisch, Walbaum did not leave an account of his punch cutting methods. However, other German punch cutters active in the 18th century did. Like Radisch, Johann Michael Fleischmann would move to the Netherlands for employment reasons. Born in 1707, he apprenticed as a punch cutter in Nuremberg in the 1720s, and much later, in the 1760s, he wrote a manuscript on punch cutting for the Plus von Amstel foundry that was only published in the 1990s. It was going to be part of a larger manual on printing that was never published. It's only a few pages long, but it stresses the importance of counterpunches to his working method. So if we assume that Walbaum cut punches in a manner similar to Fleischmann, in essence, the same method described by Fred Schmeyers in his practice-based research into punches cut in the 16th century by French and Flemish punch cutters, then we have an almost 80-year gap here between when Walbaum stopped cutting punches and when Radisch started. So this is from the French Encyclopédie. It's one of the first examples of an illustration of how counter punches and punches look. In the published record, I found very little information that talks about punch cutters' actual working methods inside of a foundry. They are the books that many of you are also familiar with, like Joseph Moxon, who will come up in a bit, and Fournier. This is an illustration from the first volume of his Manual Typographique, which is a year younger than the image I previously showed. But the first manual, for instance, that explains in detail what a typographic punch cutting apprentice is going to learn in his apprenticeship was published in 1939, which is very late. So, from about 1900 onward, typefaces were increasingly designed by external architects, and designers. From the Ruthard foundry director Karl Klingsbohr, we know that the punch cutting process for the Ekman Schrift was very difficult. Otto Ekman had delivered brush-drawn preliminary drawings to the type foundry. The forms that he used were not of the traditional variety with which the firm's punch cutters were familiar, and two different punch cutters failed to produce results that met with anyone's approval. Eventually, Louis Hohl traveled to Berlin to work with Ekman directly and arrived at the final forms of the typeface, which you can see up top here. The Klingspor Museum's collection includes one large drawing from Ekman for the Ekman Schrift and another for Peter Behrens, by Peter Behrens for the Behrens Schrift. But these drawings, they don't have letter forms that look exactly like the final typefaces. So this means, as you can see here, that there are either more drawings that haven't been saved, or Louis Hole is the final designer of the typeface. So let's compare Hole's situation with punch cutters in previous centuries. Since at least the 16th century, there were multiple environments where punches and matrices for typefaces were produced. There were independent punch cutters. They made punches and strikes. The strikes or justified matrices that were made from them were sold either to printing houses or to independent type foundries, and both of these places would cast type. Some printing houses and type foundries employed punch cutters. Indeed, some were owned by punch cutters. But at the same time, there were also plenty of independent type foundries that didn't have punch cutters working in-house at all. They only cast type from matrices that they purchased. By the 20th century, most printing establishments were not casting the type that they used anymore. Instead, they purchased it from independent type foundries, and there were dozens operating within Germany alone. The typefaces that these type foundries sold didn't all originate in-house. Type foundries from the very beginning sold matrices to each other, and there were also still independent punch cutting businesses. Indeed, the shop where Radish did his apprenticeship only cut punches. They did not cast any type. So in order for that statement of Fred's to be accurate, we need a narrow definition of a punch cutter, someone who is only cutting letters in relief into steel bars. But by the 20th century, the professional definition of a punch cutter in German type foundries had changed. For example, punch cutting also referred to cutting letter forms in relief out of blocks of softer metal. That's just the same alloy that was used for casting pieces of type. This illustration, Der Stempelschneider, or the punch cutter, was printed in 1949. And the figure here in the image is not cutting a steel bar, but a piece of softer metal. Now, I can guarantee that Karl Klingspor, who wrote the book that this is published in, knew the difference between lead and steel. Pantographic engraving, as we heard from David, was first used in type making to cut blocks of wooden type, one piece at a time. But pantographic machines developed to allow for finer results, and both punch cutting and matrix engraving machines were in use by the end of the 19th century. So I think there may be a danger in romanticizing punch cutting in steel over other forms of type making. This photo shows soft metal cutting a bit more clearly. It's a very late photo. It's from the 1980s from Stempel in Frankfurt. And this is slightly older. It's still from a 1937 Berthold film. I'm sorry for jumping back and forth between decades with my images, but I want to show the clearest examples that I was able to find. These here are soft metal masters, and they were not cut by hand like this, but by pantographic punch cutting machines. Since soft metal matrices can't be struck, matrices had to be grown around them. Electrotyping was used for this from the 1840s onwards, and you can see the process pretty well here. Several of these masters would be glued together, and then they'd be placed in an electrochemical bath across from a nickel plate. The nickel plate is here on the left, and over days or weeks, this nickel plate would dissolve, and the bits of nickel would reform around those punches. So you would take this block out, which was now surrounded in nickel, and you could take the new nickel bit off, and you could cut out these individual letter bits, which they called eyes, and place those into metal blocks, and now you have finished matrices ready for typecasting that are not struck into copper. The workers operating pantographic machines were not called punchcutters, as far as I've been able to find. But at least at Haas in Switzerland, which is outside my area of research technically, it was punchcutters who did the engraving of the patterns, as you can see here, which were used to drive the machines, the pantographic machines. Now, those machines work by having a non-punch cutting operator trace the pattern with a guide. And when we talk about type making with pantographic machines, the first step in the design process now is definitely a drawing. Before a pattern could be cut, a drawing had to be prepared. You might think that this was also the case with punches, but there's actually hardly any evidence for that having happened before industrialization. So this might sound tautological, but as the 20th century went on, there may have been fewer typographic punch cutters working in Germany simply because there were fewer foundries that could employ them. As you can see here, in the late 19th century, there were 73 type foundries active in Germany. By 1958, there were 7 in the West and 3 in the East. And of these 3 Eastern ones, only 1 was making new type, I think. The methods by which type foundry manufactured type differed from company to company and from time frame to time frame. In 1929, for instance, the Klingspor type foundry, which was not the largest type foundry in Germany, had 17 punch cutters on staff, but only 2 matrix engravers. There were other companies at the same time which had no punch cutters on staff and lots of matrix engravers. This was an atypical balance because Klingspor was a very traditionalistic house. So I want to mention 2 inventions that are not on this list that influenced 20th century type making. The first is photography, and the second is more specifically photography the way it had been used together in the 19th century with woodcut engraving. So the invention of photography allowed type foundries to reduce drawings to the final design size of a typeface. Foundry staff would transfer these photographic reductions onto the faces of punches before cutting began. This is an American woodcut, not a German one. Germany in the 19th century had very well-established professional training programs at place. At a young age, boys, and alas, it really was only boys, began apprenticeships with a firm, and they might have been 14, 15. Several days a week, or at night, or on the weekends, these boys attended art classes at local trade schools, and they would also be enrolled in skill-specific classes. So the few apprentice punch cutters would have been enrolled in engraving classes, but really we should look at this the other way around. Every year there were hundreds of young men who entered a job market trained in engraving methods, and some of them would work full-time as punch cutters, but most of them would be engaged in a variety of engraving techniques throughout their careers, which might include punch cutting sometimes, especially if they lived in a city that had a lot of type foundries. So when Carsten Lucke read my abstract, he emailed me to warn me about the Hackney-Falco thesis. This thesis proposes that the realist painters since the Renaissance, they didn't draw the composition for their paintings by eye. Instead, they used mirrors and camera obscuras to beam a scene from real life onto their canvas, and then they traced it. And he thought that I might be proposing that punch cutters weren't able to draw. That's not my thesis, but I am surprised at the lack of a paper trail regarding pre-industrial punch cutters and their drawings. Now, the punch cutting process is much more of a sculptural process than a two-dimensional one, especially if you look at small steel punches. Over 40 years ago now, John Dreyfus described examples of how photography was used in type design and type making. For instance, photographs of older printed letters could be enlarged and traced. William Morris was the first, probably, to use this method around 1890 in the design of his golden type. This is a drawing by William Morris, but it's not a tracing. I'm going to skip over this. This is a tracing. In the 1920s, British monotype enlarged photographs of letters from Aldis's Hyperautomachia Polyphily for their polyphilous typeface. Now, in this illustration, you can see two different preliminary drawings for the capital A of polyphilous, and the tracing on the left is more faithful. The one on the right is a bit simplified. Monotype would also routinely enlarge artwork from their designers to create their pattern drawings. This is Patricia Saunders tracing a capital R for Eric Gill's Perpetua. The second example Dreyfus mentioned has already been stated. That was reducing drawings down to type size. This method was used during the design of the Cranach Press Italic. The large drawing that you can see here was made in chalk by Edward Johnston, and down here is a photographic reduction by Emery Walker down to the actual size that the type was to be cut at. This was 1912-ish. I have to rely on this romanticized illustration for lack of a more detailed process photograph. Once a typeface's drawings were finished, the foundry's internal photographic unit would photograph them and reduce them to type size. And then this is their etzer, or the etcher would etch these onto the face of the punches before they were cut. Now, this is a very late example. It's from 1957. It's out of Carl Dare, his film Gravers and Files of Radish's process at Enschede. He's got this drawing which has been reduced to actual size. And here, it's difficult to see. You should follow this link and watch the video. But he's transferring this small drawing onto the face of his punch. Here, you can, if you imagine, you can see a very small P here. He's pulling the film away, having already transferred the drawing. Here it is now clearly on the face of the punch. And after he's rubbed this drawing down, he takes an etching tool and he draws an outline around the mark because the mark can be easily rubbed away in the cutting process. But also he's delineating the area of the letter form that belongs on the punch from the metal that he's going to cut away. This kind of outline etching is drawing. The oldest type founding drawings that I can find at all are Joseph Moxon's drawings in the Mechanic Exercises, which were printed in the 1680s. This book has prints of several outline drawings for upper and lowercase alphabets, and most of those alphabets are Moxon's interpretations of typefaces cut by the Dutch punch cutter Christoffel van Dyck, who Moxon knew personally, and he thought that it was the greatest punch cutter that there had been. Moxon's drawings reproduced in this book are not designs for typefaces per se. They're examples for the reader. This wasn't actually a book that was intended as a guide for printers and punch cutters. He assumed that they already knew how to do their work already. He was a scientist in the royal court, and this was for a more learned audience so that they could find out how this black art of printing actually worked. However, in his description of punch cutting, Moxon does mention that before you start cutting, you should draw or etch the letter onto the face of your punch. So his drawings that he performed may have looked similar to these, except that they would have been smaller. But still, these drawings, which are not preliminary drawings really, are closer to the shape of his own typefaces than lettering samples you'll find in 16th century writing manuals are to 16th century type. Also, you can see the X here is backwards. So I'm going to wrap up now. The examples of letter plans from the 1690s for the Roman de Bois are often reproduced. They're very detailed, but they could only serve as a loose guide for the punch cutters, because at this time it was still a century and a half away before the time where you could mechanically or photographically reduce something to punch size. Now, It's possible that for preparatory or work-in-progress punches, for this reason, the lack of a possibility of reduction, it's possible that these drawings weren't ever made because they wouldn't have performed a practical use. I still think that there probably were drawings made, but it is an explanation that I think is credible. So before Radish began working, the use of counterpunches to create the interiors of a letter form, that fell out of use. Even when counterpunches were used, typefaces would have contained counters which had to be dug out with an engraving tool instead of a counterpunch. By eliminating counterpunches, 19th and 20th century punch cutters may have made their working methods a bit more uniform, and they certainly would have made their tools and working processes similar to other kinds of engraving as were being practiced throughout the engraving trade at the time as a whole. As a result of industrialization, punch cutters performed a broader range of type-making tasks. People entering the professions were trained engravers. Their skill set helped broaden the definition of what a punch was, and punches were now anything that was cut into a metal-based media that contained a letter form. Traditional tools like counterpunches may have proven less effective in the softer metals that most punches were now being cut into. Punch cutters, finally, who had been working before the 19th century, were usually the owners or the principals of family-run cottage industries, just a few employees. But by the 20th century, they were in a working situation where they were no longer responsible for determining or developing the design of their typefaces. They were non-managerial level employees within a firm that may have hundreds of workers. Instead of interpreting their own designs into steel, they interpreted the designs of others into various different metal media. So that's it. Thank you very much.